WURD, Progressive Black Talk Media. Welcome to Reality Check. We have another special edition. This is a special Wednesday session, special Wednesday edition of Reality Check, your daily dose of public affairs here on WURD. And it just so happens to be another day of the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference annual meeting. It's the annual meeting. We did that yesterday, had a special live broadcast of a panel on critical race theory here on Reality Check, exclusively on WURD. You don't get this anywhere else. WURD, always the home of Black Talk Media, but the home of many other special things as well, including these very specialized sessions, these very essential discussions that we're having on issues like critical race theory and reparations. Today, we will be talking about reparations. We have a panel lined up for you today. We're going to start momentarily. Just want to once again give a large, warm thanks to the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference for allowing us to air this very special conversation, this very special panel on reparations, which also is being held live during the Council of State Governments ERC annual meeting. We would have been in Toronto, Ontario. Toronto is one of my favorite places, by the way. I love Toronto. I am so missing Caravana this year, but we'll get that next year, hopefully. But we were supposed to be in Toronto, Ontario on site this year for the CSG conference, and that would have been so awesome because we were also planning to broadcast Reality Check from Toronto, Canada. That did not happen thanks to COVID, but hopefully we'll be in full gear next year for wherever we are. But in the meantime, we'll have this live virtually. That's what the technology is there for. That's why that's why people have invented it, to do things special. Events, special activities such as this. I'm Charles Ellison, by the way. I'm your host, executive producer, and creator of Reality Check. I'm also the moderator of this discussion, which will go on for about 90 minutes. We have our panelists here with us right now. I want to also thank Debbie Ann Page, once again, the director of the Council on Communities of Color. The Council on Communities of Color is a part of Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, which once again covers all the states in the Northeast, provinces in Canada, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands as well. We have participants, attendees to this panel that are waiting for that discussion. Attendees, including some state legislators from various states. If you have questions or comments during the duration of this panel, please leave them in the Zoom chat room. Folks who are listening in via WURD 96.1 FM, 900 AM, wordradio.com, WURD TV, leave your comments and questions in the Facebook live stream. That's one way of doing it. Facebook live stream at facebook.com/forward. You can also leave it in the comments section at youtube.com/onword. You can also send me an email, cellison@wordradio.com, and hit me on Twitter. Tag me on Twitter at Ellison Report, #Reality Check, and I'll be checking there as well. Some of you can direct message me as well. Okay, let's get it started. First, just a quick remark from Maryland House Delegate Jocelyn Pena Melnick, who is vice chair for the Council on Communities of Color at the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Delegate, good morning to you once again.
Good morning to you. Thank you so much for being a wonderful moderator and for being so generous. I want to welcome all of you to CSG Council on Communities of Color. This is a safe space where we have very honest, frank conversations that are very important. I want to thank Ms. Debbie Page for keeping us on track, the panelists and attendees. I know you could have been anywhere else this morning and you're here with us, so may you be blessed and welcome. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Delegate. Really appreciate it. And I always appreciate the work that you're doing with the council and also in your district in Maryland. So also want to give thanks to your constituents in the great state of Maryland for giving us for a few moments to join us for this panel. Let me introduce the panelists real quick so we can go ahead and get started. One of our panelists who is scheduled to be on with us today, Mike Green, who all of you, if you listen to Reality Check regularly, are familiar with, unfortunately unable to join us. He had a very sudden schedule conflict. It was very sudden. He does apologize for that. He will not be joining us this morning, excuse me. But however, we do have Pennsylvania State Representative Chris Rabb, who represents 200th Legislative District in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, pahouse.com/Rabb, RABB, for more information, particularly if you're a constituent representing parts of Philadelphia. Representative, good to see you this morning.
Here.
All right, good. Jessica Aiwuyor is the founder, also president of the National Black Cultural Information Trust. She is one of the leading national voices on the conversation about reparations. She is one of the leading, you can argue, the leading lobbyists pushing for the passage of HR 40, that legislation everyone's talking about, to create a commission on reparations that is currently still sitting in the U.S. House of Representatives. We're still waiting on its passage. Jessica can give us some insights on that. And she's joined us on Reality Check before, and our previous discussion, CSG East put together on reparations. Jessica, good to see you this morning.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, excellent. It's always good to see you, Jessica, too. So from that other great state of South Carolina, I miss my folks down there in South Carolina, so can't wait to get to South Carolina State University for their homecoming as well at one point. So nbcit.org for more information on the National Black Cultural Information Trust. Okay, let's go ahead and get to it. Another thing, too, is that this is part two of a conversation we had on reparations earlier that Jessica was on and Mike was on, too. It was a great conversation that the Council of State Governments, ERC, put together as one of our micro summits. In our last conversation, Jessica, we talked about the definition of reparations. And so since then, that was about a few months ago, has that definition changed any? I mean, are you still working off the same operating definition of what is reparations in your mind?
I think the definition of reparations is an ongoing discussion. I certainly believe that reparations is about repairing the harms and injuries that were done to descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States, but also for repairing the following injuries after enslavement, as well as the current injuries that we also endure. But I think how we frame that and how we look at that is constantly evolving as we continue to try to come up with ways to address the full repair that is needed.
Yeah. How about you, Representative Rabb? You weren't on that part one discussion, but I would love to get, sort of because especially as you're working on some legislation right now with respect to state level reparations, which we don't often talk about. We're going to get into that later, but your operating definition of reparations.
I like what Jessica said. I mean, why mess with a good thing? I mean, look, I'm not trying to be
She's the foremost authority, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, my experience as a Black man in the United States has been, at best, government seeking to address some symptoms of systemic issues, and most of the time in bad faith. So anything that addresses structural issues and deals with systemic racism, white supremacy, structural inequality in good faith, with intentionality around improving and honoring Black lives, that falls in the domain of reparations. But I think even more importantly, reparations is not how Black folk are compensated. It is how society is repaired, because white supremacy destroys everything. Most white folk are not fully benefiting from their full humanity with white supremacy. It is a disease that infects everyone and everything. As a policymaker in Pennsylvania, I like to say that if there is a white woman, single mom with a baby who embraces QAnon and doesn't support vaccines and so forth, and she's working at Denny's, she's making $2.83 an hour, and she's struggling. And the reason she's making $2.83 is because that's what the tipped minimum wage is in Pennsylvania. And the tipped minimum wage is an outgrowth of systemic racism and Southern elites not wanting to pay Black people for their labor after slavery. That's the origins of the tip minimum wage. So even white people who hate Black people are not benefiting from white supremacy, because they are being exploited at $2.83 in 2021, the richest country in world history. So there may be certain narrow short-term benefits of white privilege, But what does that mean when you can't feed your family? What does that
Right.
mean when you are, estranged from things that everyone should get in a society that is supposed to have abundance on all levels? So I think when we look at reparations, of course, it is, as someone who has 16 great-great-grandparents born into slavery from 6 states, as far south as Mississippi, as far north as Manhattan, I want reparations for my people. We know that we have been victorious, not when individuals get whatever it is they want, but when society as a whole is rid of white supremacy and there is no distinction between outcomes between Black folk and anyone else.
That's the way you laid that out, Representative. It also presents something of a business case, right? I always go back to, like, what's the business case? Like, as we're pushing for major policy concepts like reparations. Obviously, there are the moral and altruistic aspects of it, right? But there are also there's other groups who may be initially resistant, like those, like you were just saying, those working class poor white people in a place like rural Pennsylvania who don't like, generally speaking, don't like Black people, but don't realize that their conditions are a result of that hatred and that violence against Black people. But it's like, okay, well, they're going to ask that question. This thing about reparations for Black people, what's in it for me? And it's that business case. Talk to that. Speak to that, Jessica, about, like, especially as you're having those conversations and you're doing that advocacy legwork, that lobbying legwork on Capitol Hill to get HR 40 passed. Like, especially what the dynamics of those conversations with, for example, white members of Congress, like, just explaining to them, hey, your white constituents, you as a white person, you're also going to get quite a bit out of this as well. This is repair for the country. This is a big economic fix for the country, just as much for you as it is for us.
Well, I think there's definitely a business argument for repair, for full repair, and there always has been. It's just never been a lucrative thing to be discriminatory to potential customers or the overall general public. In fact, I believe it was Citigroup that came out with a study that said $16 trillion has been lost due to discrimination. And so that's a huge impact, and it's actually teetering around the number that we say, that some economists say reparations should be in that $1 trillion area. So if businesses and the economy are losing trillions due to discrimination and racism, that's certainly an argument. I think sometimes people don't really connect the dots, but I used to be the Associate Director of Comms at National Fair Housing Alliance. And I've used this example before on your show, Charles, that we would literally see banks just not keep up their own bank-owned properties in Black neighborhoods. So they were literally losing money on properties that they owned, but because they did not find them valuable enough to keep up the properties like they would in similar properties owned in white neighborhoods by the same banks, they instead would let the property value just fall. So it made no sense. Like, NAFA would go to court and say, you're actually losing money by, like, you're being discriminatory on one hand and racist, but then you're also losing money by not, fulfilling the needs of this community with your own bank-owned property. But I also am cautious of the business argument, because even though it exists and it's very much true, I mean, that's just not the focal point. And we've known that oftentimes for African Americans, whenever we get any type of justice, it really goes against the tide of popularity in the country at that time. So I hesitate to emphasize the business benefits, even though they do exist and I will acknowledge them, but instead emphasize the fact that people are harmed and this needs to be repaired, and we need to figure out ways to repair it. And there are business ways to do that, but that isn't the focal point.
You know, that's a good point to make. You know, because at the end of the day, it is a harm that's been inflicted on us over several hundred years, and we need to do away with that harm. We need to eliminate that harm. You know, just get a real quick update. I want to get an update from you both, Jessica from the federal level, representative from the state level. You know, just updates on where you are with your individual efforts. I'll start with you again, Jessica. Where are things right now with HR 40, with this legislation? And let's be clear, this is legislation to create a commission, because there are people out there in the public discourse who make it seem like this is legislation to activate reparations. No, we got to first create a commission, first step, and determine how much are we talking about in terms of reparations. But where is HR 40 right now in the policy making, the sausage making process?
Well, I also wanted to add, HR 40 is also about creating proposals. So once the commission studies, then they would make proposals, and that would be the next step. So HR 40 is more than a study. That some folks think it is, but it's just a study, but it is more than a study because it goes into the proposal phase.
Thank you for that.
Yes, and then there's 193 co-sponsors of it right now. And I'm not sure when this will be taken up and moved to the House floor, but that is where we are at the moment.
And Representative, talk about what you're working on. You were talking about a form of reparations or a framework for reparations. Get into the details of that coming out of the Pennsylvania legislature, something that Pennsylvania could do.
Sure. If I could for a quick second go back to language that you use, the business case. As someone who talks about entrepreneurship and business, I appreciate the language. I think in this context, I just want to piggyback on something Jessica said.
Please do.
I think perhaps the framing I would recommend, what is the enlightened self-interest of white folk and non-Black folk for getting on board for supporting reparations? Because if we talk about the business case, that validates it even just implicitly, the capitalist society in which we operate, which is predicated on enslaved Black labor. So the very notion of capital is the origin of what Blackness is. Right? Blackness was created to allow white folk to create a class of, for most of the time we weren't considered human, capital to create financial wealth for them. And it is the basis of race. So you can't talk about capitalism without talking about systemic racism or white supremacy. You can't do it. And so any capitalistic solutions to reparations will fail. And what I like to tell people is, because I have a lot of folks come to me like, where's my check? Because I heard your proposal doesn't give me my check. And I'm like, if you believe that reparations is what's necessary to address systemic racism, then you understand that the solution to systemic problems must be systemic solutions. And so a systemic solution does not centralize you getting a check. Now, that doesn't mean I'm opposed to cutting checks. I'm not, but that ain't nearly enough. And I don't care how many trillions y'all want to come up with to say this is what it is. If we don't have equity, then that number is going to keep growing and growing. And we know what the outcomes are. We have been saying and documenting for generations the disparities, whether it's health, education, housing, on and on and on. Once there are no disparities based on ethnicity or racial identity, we know that reparations has worked. You can give us all $100 million each, but if those racial disparities persist, it ain't enough. So to me, the goal is really about addressing systems, and we can't talk about reparations without talking about how capitalism is indicted. So even though there are businesses and Black consumers that have lost money and tons of money, there are other businesses that profiteer off of that misery and that predation. That is their business model. So I think there's some businesses who have no business opening their mouths around reparations because they're part of the problem, because their business model is inherently predatory. And I don't actually believe that some of these, not just some of these corporations, but some of these industries should even exist. So I
what are you working on?
Original point, though.
What are you working on, Representative? Yeah, get into that.
Yeah.
And then Jessica, I have a couple of quick questions for you, but go ahead, Representative.
Okay, so 2 years ago, I announced that I would be introducing a bill on state-based reparations in Pennsylvania for slavery and systemic racism. I never introduced it because just the ancestral calling to do this work is so important to honor the legacy that I want to do it right. And frankly, I don't know if I want to introduce it without letting Jessica sing it first, letting other folks put their fingerprints on it. So, but I can tell you the framework. It is a bill that acknowledges the complicity in the state government in systemic racism and white supremacy, and it creates an independent authority that is independently funded and can receive funds beyond the state, can get federal money, can get philanthropic money, can get money from individuals to put into place proposals that its board comes up with its staff, and actually invests in those communities that need it most. So it is an independent and autonomous entity that is set up by state government, but has distance from the legislature, has distance from the executive branch in order to make the appropriate changes. And if you don't have Black folk in charge, and you don't have a budget, and you don't have autonomy, it's not going to work. And the last piece I want to mention, which help influence this, is I have a bill to repeal the death penalty in Pennsylvania. And there was a study by a commission to study abolition of the death penalty in Pennsylvania. It took them 7 years. The report was 200 pages, and I'll give you the overview. The death penalty is problematic, Charles. That was the conclusion. Well, we knew that 7 years ago. We didn't need 200 pages and however many work hours to produce it, and nobody read the report. So I'm not starting with the commission in my bill. I'm starting with an independent authority that can raise money through bonds, that can get money outside of the government, that can do all kinds of things, that is not dependent on what the legislature does, and will require a functional diversity among Black folk in those positions to make those changes.
Once again, if you're just now tuning in, you are listening to a special Wednesday edition of Reality Check here on WURD, WURD Progressive Black Talk Media, 96.1 FM, 900 AM, wordradio.com, WURD TV, WURD app. If you are a participant or an attendee of the actual Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference annual meeting, this is a live broadcast on WURD as well. As an attendee, you have the special privilege for the purpose of this event of leaving your questions and comments. I see a few of them in the Zoom group chat, because we are doing this in Zoom as we're broadcasting this live on air. Leave your comments and questions in the Zoom group chat. I will get to them, I promise, momentarily. And also for those of you listening or watching through WURD, you can leave questions and comments at our Facebook live stream page, facebook.com/4word, in the comments section on YouTube. Our YouTube live stream is for WURD TV is youtube.com/onword. Jessica, as you're hearing the representative talk about that, for a couple of questions for you. One is, like, how plugged in are you into some of the state level activity that's happening around reparations? Because the state enslavement was, you can make the argument, was determined to a large degree on the state you lived in, right? I mean, it was like the status of if you were Black at that time and you were enslaved, it depended on the state you lived in. So it feels like kind of natural to assume that, we really should be looking at some kind of big, bold movement for state reparations, or looking at what each individual state can do. How plugged are you to that activity, and just your reflections in response to what Chris Rabb is working on?
I'm paying a lot of attention to it. So I wanted to raise up two very
important
names that are really some of the foremost authorities on local reparations. Cam Howard, who's the national co-chair of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, has been working on local reparations for a really long time. And he has a guide really to how to enact local reparations that includes a lot of key definitions and descriptions. And that is available online. If you just go Cam Howard Local Reparations, you'll be able to find where to purchase the guide. Also, Robin Rue Simmons, who is the woman that brought Evanston, Illinois reparations, or was the foremost leader in getting that going. And there has been a lot of positive feedback on that, and there's been some criticism, but at the end of the day, this has never been done before, which should tell you something, that it's very hard. That is very hard just to get to that point in terms of local reparations and using cannabis in order to do it, which is very interesting considering how many Black people have been sent to jail or in prison due to marijuana sales. And now we have all these other people that are white making all this money off of cannabis. So I do think that it was very important that they made that connection and tried to tie it into reparatory justice. I think there's a lot going on the local level. There's mayors coming together. There's coalitions of mayors coming together. I believe the acronym is MORE, M-O-R-E, for the group of mayors that are coming together to try to come up with local-based solutions for reparations. There are groups of descendants, like Georgetown descendants, coming together. There are the Gullah Geechee that are coming together. They've always been demanding, land back and speaking out against the unjust taxes on land and that kind of, and the land grabbing and the need for reparatory justice. So it's a lot of different things going on, but you're right, Charles. It is natural to think about what is happening at the local level and want to yes, and also address that through whichever means. And I go back and forth between local and state, because sometimes the whole state is not involved in the process, though I believe they should be. Like a state like South Carolina should be ideally leading the charge on reparatory justice for their citizens, and specifically Gullah Geechee people that are losing land due to climate change and land grab and all this other stuff. But on the local level, it's a lot of different things happening. And the good thing is it helps us in terms of creativity and trial and error. Each community is different. So the harms, though there may be similarities, they have different harms that those communities will try to address. So when they come up with their own commissions or groups or whatever, it is going to be different according to what they endured. So for Evanston, for example, it was a housing-based thing because they studied it and they knew specifically the time frame for when people were discriminated against due to being Black for housing. And so that's why they did it that way. But it's so many different ways that people are going about the state or local-based issue.
Also, just as a reminder, we were talking about, cost earlier on, there is a plenary session at the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference Annual Summit entitled "What Racism Costs Everyone." Heather McGee of Demos is the keynote speaker for that plenary session that's taking place tomorrow from noon to 1:30 p.m. For more information, go to csg-erc.org. For more information. That's Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. And so that should be a very interesting conversation. I'm sure it's going to be sort of an extension of that as well. So, Representative, and how, you were asking earlier, I'm going to start getting into some questions here we're seeing in the Zoom group chat. And then in about 5 minutes or so, we'll be joined by Mike Green. Couldn't join us today, unfortunately, but Dr. G.S. Potter, senior editor of the bnote.com, has agreed to fill that space. She will be joining us by Zoom very shortly in a few minutes. How can states help with HR 40? How can an organization like a CSG East, for example, Council on Communities of Color, assist with that? Like, let's get your thoughts on that. Like, you were talking about you need Jessica to see what you're working on. How can you get involved in what Jessica is working on, right?
Absolutely. And to me, this is not an either or situation. Of course, we should support what's happening on the federal level. It would be absurd and inappropriate not to. It is equally absurd to think that doing something on the state level takes away with what's going on the federal level. We do that around the minimum wage. We do that around environmental issues. In fact, I mean, that is the norm, that we do things simultaneously on the state and federal level. And they can complement each other. The other thing too is, not only should we do it at the federal level and the state level, we should do it at the local level, like Jessica said, but we also need to do it in the private sector. We need to do it in the independent sector, that's philanthropy, which is born out of basically robber barons, hiding their money and taking their blood money and using it for good purposes, or ostensibly good purposes. So the philanthropic sector needs to have this addressed. Private sector, also the academia, absolutely. I'm a graduate of Yale University. There would be no Yale in terms of their wealth, without enslaved labor. That is true for many elite institutions across the country. And it also has to be addressed in religious orders. Like Jessica mentioned, Georgetown University has reparations for the descendants of the enslaved Black folk who they sold in order to get the land. I went to elementary school with one of those descendants. That's real and eminently doable, and every institution should be doing that. That should not even be controversial at this point. If your ancestors were owned as property and capital to be used for profit for that institution, and you can identify any descendants of those folks, why wouldn't you do that? We have rich universities like Harvard and other places that say, if you come from a family with a household income under X, you go for free. Well, why would you extend that to folks who were injured by their association with slavery? It makes perfect sense. Also, I see in the comments, there should be truth and reconciliation.
Right. We had a Vermont State Representative Hal Colston, who's been in, I think he was on that. No, he was on another Council of State Governments Micro Summit conversation. But I appreciate that, Representative Colston. And I know that there is a truth and reconciliation bill or legislation that was introduced in the Vermont State Legislature. How important is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process for delivering reparations was his question. Go ahead, Representative. I want you to answer that. And also, Jessica, you too, to offer something on that too as well.
Well, if there's not buy-in to something that narrowly passes, let's say Obamacare, right? So many things that were passed by
Affordable Care Act.
Right. I mean, you name it, right? I mean, in my state, we got $7 billion from the Biden administration, and Republicans didn't want to spend it because none of the US senators supported it and they would look hypocritical. And I'm not trying to get partisan here, but I'm making a point that truth and reconciliation, that is the means by which people process the terror. They process the injustice. They understand it is contextualized. It is made real and visceral for all parties to understand why this is important, as opposed to it being pushed down someone's throat. Getting to the table in good faith and saying, this is what it's all about. And we are all stakeholders, regardless of what our ancestors look like or what they did. That is important. That is important work. And when it comes to promoting reparations, I really believe white folk who understand its importance need to lead with other white folk. I think they're more likely to listen to white folk than to listen to Black folk, generally speaking, and specifically. I think we all have a role to play. But specifically with states, we have a $36 billion annual budget. We have access to a lot of money. We can raise a lot of money. We have authority and responsibilities that are vastly larger than any one municipality or coalition of municipalities. And we have a moral obligation because many of these states either enshrined slavery into law. It was not a federal law, it was a state law. and the ones who either abolished slavery early still invested in enslaved labor, including Pennsylvania. But people like to say Pennsylvania was the first state to abolish slavery, but the reality was it was gradual abolition, and it took them 75 years to actually shut down the institution. And all the while, they had white supremacist, anti-Black laws on the books, and they invested in institutions and other schemes that were based on enslaved labor. So it is a moral imperative that states lead on this while we work on the federal level and on the local level.
Representative, let me let Jessica chime in here. What you think, Jessica, about those Truth and Reconciliation Commissions? I mean, the more notable ones we know of are like on the African continent, like in South Africa, right? Or Rwanda. We know about those notable South Africa, you know, there's arguments that it worked, other arguments that maybe didn't work as well. But your thoughts on, you know, is that part of one of the initial or more important steps, like even as we create that commission to study, to analyze, and come up with recommendations for reparation?
I think that many reparationists support truth and reconciliation, but also are cautious that at sometimes they can be used to deter from delivering actual tangible results. And so we would remind everyone that if you're going to do a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, let it be attached to a purpose, a end goal, a target of, okay, we did this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was important. We got everybody to the table. Now, what are we going to deliver to the people in a way that delivers them tangible results and works towards the healing process beyond speaking about it?
Mm-hmm. We have, oh, go ahead, Jessica.
I was just gonna say, because what can happen is some people say, okay, we did this, because it's very hard even sometimes to even get an apology. So, right.
Yeah.
And people, some folks, some white people and some Black folks will think, okay, we got the apology, let's just be done with it. But that's not enough. And so I think they should be attached to something very key that we can say we're doing something on.
Now we're going to bring in our next panelist, Dr. G.S. Potter. She's a regular contributor here on Reality Check WURD, senior editor of the bnote.com. She's joining us by audio here on Zoom. Dr. Potter, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Just wanted real quick, because you've been hearing some of the conversation, like we just started talking about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, what that looks like. Is that something that we need? Is that something essential? What are your thoughts on it?
I think it's something that definitely is needed in terms of community healing, especially as a representative said. This is also part of the process of healing trauma and acknowledging truth. I think it's important for setting a historical standard, especially in how we teach the history of what has happened to people in this country, especially Black people, the formerly enslaved, the descendants of the formerly enslaved. But I think it also creates a stronger legal basis for us to move forward with different lawsuits, especially if we're looking at discrimination lawsuits, pushing reparations forward. We need to have a strong narrative moving into the courtroom. And I think grounding that narrative in the understanding that slavery was wrong, it caused damage, and it caused damages that need to be remedied in part by monetary compensation. I think all of those are needed, and all of those can come from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Dr. Potter, I would be real curious to get you, because we got this from the other two panelists, from Representative Rabb, from Jessica Aiwuyor of NBCIT. Your definition, your operational definition of reparations, when you're thinking about reparations, what does that look like to you?
For me, I have to piggyback and say, I like what she said. I think that we have to be very careful when it comes to the definition of reparations. Now, a lot of times community members will say that, the indigenous folks got reparations. And if you want to call reparations about $1,000 a piece attached to a lawsuit, attached to government manipulation of how that money was spent, attached to the complete inability to file any further lawsuits for any further claims, then sure, they got reparations. But if we're talking about community healing for actual slavery and what came after it in multiple fields in multiple ways, like not just money, including more educational opportunities, including more land, including more social services, that kind of thing, then we can't define reparations according to what happened to Indigenous people, for example. So I think we need to be really clear on how expansive reparations is, what timeframes it spans, and who it covers. But I think we need to do it in the most inclusive and expansive and ever expanding way possible, and not treat it as a one-shot deal, but treat it as the beginning of a process of healing.
We got Dr. J.S. Potter on now with us, joining by audio. We've got Jessica Aiwuyor, who is the founder, president of the National Black Cultural Information Trust, and Representative Chris Rabb. He represents the 200th Legislative District in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. NBCIT.org for more information on National Black Cultural Information Trust, one of the leading organizations on this fight for reparations on Capitol Hill. Representative Chris Rabb, leading legislator, leading voice on also coming up with systemic reparation packages in the Pennsylvania State Legislature, pahouse.com/RABB/Rabb. He is at Rep Rabb on social media as well. Do we really, I wonder about this. Go to you, Representative Rabb, about how much, because I know you've been watching the critical race theory discussion. Maybe you heard some of what we were talking with your colleague, Representative Donna Bullock was on that panel yesterday. How much does that discussion influence this reparations discussion, I wonder?
Every conversation that addresses race or is impacted by race influences the reparations discussion. So absolutely critical race theory controversy, tempest in a teapot, absolutely does, because what it seeks to do is degrade the legitimacy of discussing the true history and true critical thought around the institutions that conservative snowflakes want to hold up as fragile as it is, because it is fiction. It is all fiction, and that fiction, it defines them and it scares them. And these are the death pangs of the right wing, seeing a society that's browning every generation, and it's making them very nervous. And so they're grabbing at anything. If somebody wanted to have a good faith conversation, critical race theory, you might think they would want to talk to people who taught critical race theory. I went up to my colleague who introduced this racist bill on the floor, and I said, hey, I know a bunch of folks, including my co-parent who teaches this, would you like to talk to them? And he's like, no, I'm good. So I don't really want to engage people who are not operating in good faith and who are using racist tropes, but all of this impacts the discussion around reparations. And because ultimately there are people who do not, on one side is people who do not believe that Black people deserve anything, even our full humanity. And we know who those people are. And then there's folks who like saying, oh, well, where will it end? And how do you do it? And numbers too big, so therefore we shouldn't do it. But having just moved out of Afghanistan and adding up all the numbers, what is it, 3 trillion, Charles? What's the number? Whatever number it is, multi-trillion, for 20 years, and have nothing to show for it. No one can ever tell anyone who believes in reparations that we don't have the money for it. They can never use that argument given what Biden just did and what happened. Nation building is, I want to get into foreign policy, but my point is we have the money for things that, there's a political will for. Even if it's based on lies and fiction, reparations is something that can actually repair the social fabric of our country and allow us to be great. And critical race theory is one of many kind of racial boogeymen to get us off course.
This is a question from a viewer on WURD TV, Junior Lee, and I appreciate Junior Lee, you watching. Jessica, should we be pushing for a federal government department of reparations with a cabinet member such as a reparations secretary to facilitate policies and monies relating to the matter? Similar to the Native Americans, that's what Junior Lee is here saying. So Jessica, go ahead and What do you think of that? And GS, I might ask you to respond to that as well, but go ahead.
I really have to be honest. I do not know if that is the best route. I think that if going through HR 40 and allowing the commission to do the study and create the proposal is the best route for us to really see what is going to work for our communities. As Dr. Potter pointed out, what was done for Indigenous communities, for Native Americans, might not necessarily work for us. It could, it might not, I'm not sure. But I think that that also goes to the larger question that some people feel that Biden could just do he could just put out a presidential mandate for reparations, which I also am unsure of, as well as how that would look and how that would work. And so I'm sticking to HR 40 and allowing the commission to come together to do its job, to do the study, to figure out what would be best, and then submit proposals for that.
Dr. Potter, what do you think of that? Because you coming from that Indigenous perspective, Indigenous community perspective, anyhow, I would be real curious to get your thoughts on like kind of that elevating this to a cabinet level response or a cabinet level kind of operation or capacity, if this were something that would come into play here.
Right. I'd have to say, if we're looking at the Indigenous experience, that level of response that was received in those communities was a site of corruption, and it was used to actually prevent people from getting the monies that they were supposed to be awarded in due time. So I think we can say that we could learn from that failure and how things were distributed, and maybe allow the commission to consider that and how they decide to create a new structure. I believe a form of federal organization is going to be necessary, but I don't think that we need to repeat the same mistakes that we've made historically, because a lot of these mistakes, even after we've won the legislative victory, when it comes down to actually distributing, money or resources, it doesn't get to the people that it needs to. And a lot of that can be unintentional, but a lot of that is very intentional. So we have to be really strategic. And I agree. Let's let the commission do that work.
There's another question. I'm getting at some of these questions that we're getting from both the attendees of the virtual conference, the CSG East annual meeting, and also some good questions that are coming out of comments on the Facebook live comment section for WURD TV. Raphael Suleiman asked, what about the state of this current economy and how it might affect the distribution of reparations? Inflation may cause a deep recession. If the reparations monetary goal is $20 trillion, he also cites the founder of this movement, a very controversial movement called ADOS, Yvette Carnell, who says that the reparations argument has to be a national issue. But he's saying if the reparations monetary goal is $20 trillion, this might not happen if the economy tanks. Reparations could be pushed back for another generation. Going back to Representative Rabb, what's your thought on that? That's an interesting question.
Well, it's not like there's going to be a $20 trillion check cut. It's not. This is something that doesn't happen overnight.
That's why I wanted to throw that question at you. It's like it's kind of focused on this needs to be very intentional, very methodical, and systematic. It has to be as systematic and systemic as even the racism to fully counter that kind of damage over several hundred years.
Yeah, we're talking. Think about the checks we've been getting under the previous president and under President Biden, right? These are, I think, too small for most Americans, but these are huge outlays of federal money. And most economists will say this makes sense because most people who are going to get this money are going to recirculate it in the economy immediately. The poorer they are, the quicker they will spend the money on local businesses to meet their needs. They're not buying Lamborghinis. They're not, they're buying what they need to. And similarly, reparations could have a similar impact that could benefit the economy. My goal here is not to talk about how it can help rich white people in an economy, but just from economically speaking, I don't think there's a justification to say this will reparations plan will bankrupt
Will wreck the economy.
The economy. I don't think that's a good argument or a particularly sound argument, but I don't believe ADOS is a particularly sound argument.
I don't either. So you and I agree on that.
Any more oxygen.
We can have a whole panel on that. I don't either. And Jessica, want to get you. Right, with not right now. Right. And in fact, we don't need to. Yeah, because there's no need to give anything any more legitimacy. Right, that's not really even all that legit, but that's another conversation. Jessica, yeah, your thoughts on that? But because also along with Raphael added a part two of that question where can't full repair for Black people be achieved if we work to change the business culture and climate in poor Black communities around America, which I do think is a valid question. That's something we need to think about. Especially as we're trying to repair things and create like a new systems. But go ahead, Jessica.
So I think that certainly, I don't think that the current economy would be like a deterrent for moving forward with reparations. I think, in fact, it strengthens our argument for why we need reparations. If we see what has happened to Black communities throughout this pandemic, the pandemic has really caused extreme harm across the nation, but specifically to our communities that were already facing systemic healthcare issues, racism, that were already having all of these various harms dealing with housing. And now we're having to do these eviction moratoriums and all these different types of things. Black businesses that are gone by the rate of 40%. What we can see from what has happened during this pandemic is not only are we harmed, but when something affects the nation in such a devastating way as this, it crushes us even more than everybody else. And so I think it strengthens the argument for why we need reparations. But I don't think we can look at the economy and say that's why we're not going to get it, because clearly, as the representative stated, we come up with money for the things we want to come up for as a nation. So there's that. In terms of businesses in local communities, I think it can be a part of repairing harms. We see that there's so many predatory businesses located in Black communities. We have check cashing places, we have title loans, we have all these things when we could just have more banks that are equitable. And I'm not sticking up for the banking system here because I know how systemically racist it is, but at the same time, and this isn't sticking up for them, but this is emphasizing that there are areas that are underbanked. And because of that, the predatory systems come in and fulfill that need. And so there are ways to end that harm or decrease that harm by increasing access to banking. And similarly, we could say the same thing about healthcare and urgent care centers and access to hospitals and access to affordable healthcare. I feel like the argument for universal healthcare is there, but I won't go that far into it right now. But the point is, there are things that we can do within local communities to decrease the harms. And I do think that banking is one of those things: affordable, equitable, accessible banking.
And really, Dr. Potter, right? I mean, reparations, when we get into definitions, reparations is really a major demand for the end of racism. It's just the end of racism. It's the end of racism. As I'm hearing everyone talk about it, the way Jessica just was talking about, the way the representative was talking about it, the way Dr. Potter, like we're basically saying, you know what? This is like, we are now asking, we are demanding, we are proposing to completely blow up the Death Star, like forever. And so I think that that's really important there. Dr. Potter, your thoughts on what's being said here as far as like the economic dimension of this, and whether or not it does bankrupt the nation, right? Given the current economic state, and is that a viable counter? Is that a viable argument, a viable consideration as we move forward with these reparations proposals?
Well, as I said previously, I think that the reparations movements that we have now should be seen as just a beginning, and that it's going to be multi-sectoral. It's going to be multiple payouts in multiple sectors, and it's not just going to be monetary compensation. I think it's important to bolster the business sector. It's ridiculous that only like 2% of businesses in Philly are owned by Black folks. Like that is a crime in and of itself. But it points to the larger crimes that cannot be controlled just through economic ambition. Like we had Black Wall Street burnt down. There's people that are going to want to stop economic mobility to any extent they can. So I'd like to see reparations also come with a long list of legal barriers that stop things like redlining and that force banks to do equitable loans and grants going out to people in equitable fashions. We need protections for those businesses once they are in place, so they're not falling victim to predatory lenders and to people that want to do harm to them. So I think offensively, yeah, absolutely, we need to get more money into Black businesses for Black people, for Black patrons, and to get that Black economy going very strong. But we have to acknowledge that there are going to be people that have histories of using the law to take it away once it's already been given. So we need to not only give things to offensively Black folks, but defend them so that if something does happen, there are very severe consequences for people that try to discriminate.
Go ahead, Representative.
Dr. Potter made the best case for why states have an important role in reparations, because the things that she's talking about are impacted by state laws. And you can have a law in the books that's on paper, but if it's not enforced, if there's no money, there's no real compliance, there's no teeth, it doesn't matter. So all the things that Dr. Potter just mentioned can be implemented by force of law on the state level and on the federal level too. And that will help what folks do on the local level. So none of this is about saying, oh, we need to do this on the state and everyone else needs to. No, it's all of us working together in tandem, learning from each other and complementing each other. That's how it has to happen. And Dr. Potter's absolutely right. Black excellence is something that we are proud of. And many of us descend from Black excellence and glom to it. But in white society, it has always been punished. And we need to have safeguards to make sure that should we benefit in a transgenerational way, broadly, multi-sector way, that level of punishment and retribution cannot happen like it's happened in every single generation we've been here.
Yeah, here's another question too. That's a real good points, Dr. Potter and Representative Rabb. I just want to raise this question with you and then go around the table. This is coming from Council Communities of Color Director Debbie Ann Page, who makes these conversations possible. And she's asking, how do we calculate? This is a very important question. I asked it before, but I think we need to ask it again. How do we calculate who is eligible for reparations? Because we have this, once again, this ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves movement versus everybody Black else argument that's dominated the discussion. And how do we address that? It comes up to, I think about it, I am the direct descendant of formerly enslaved Black people in the United States from the South, but I'm biracial. My father was white. And so I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of eligibility for me and my children to get reparations, right? So it is an argument that frequently comes up, especially in this tension between Black Americans, Caribbean Americans, Africans who are in Black migrants in America. How do we determine eligibility? Jessica, and last panel, you addressed this, Jessica, so beautifully, but I want to hear that again. I think the audience needs to hear it.
Okay, so again, this is from Cam Howard, and he's done all this incredible work as the national co-chair of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. But the way that he explains it is that reparations is more than for a one-time event. So a lot of times people think of it just about enslavement, but reparations is for 3 periods, according to him and his work. It's for enslavement, it's for Jim Crow and the era after enslavement, it's for the current injuries that we face today. And if you break it down according to that, then you will get a greater sense of eligibility in that sense. And know that it's not about a Black American in the traditional sense versus everybody else, but you really get to see the interconnectedness in how we've all been harmed by these systems. Then we say, okay, for those of us that are descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States, is the acronym for that. You could calculate reparations in terms of enslavement, Jim Crow, and current harms. For folks that came here in different migration waves, they've also endured similar harms. It might not have been for enslavement on this land. They were also enslaved, though I would like to highlight, and the United States did play a role in enslavement on other lands, but we won't go all there right now. I think the
Right.
Commission should do that, though. But for folks that came in other waves of migrations, they also endured harms. They endured harms due to Jim Crow. They endured harms concerning housing, concerning banking, concerning redlining, all those things. Those should be remedied as well. So they should be that, we could calculate it in that terms for other people that are also of African descent in this country, and for the current harms as well. We can't disconnect what we're dealing with in Black communities and say, okay, because you're Jamaican, you shouldn't benefit from equitable banking because you are not a descendant of African. Like it's ridiculous. So when we look at it, we really have to be careful with trying to have these strict hardline rules, because we end up really working and doing the bidding of white supremacy and not fully addressing the core harms. So I think of it in that sense, those three time periods: enslavement, Jim Crow, post Jim Crow, and the harms that we're enduring right now. And that way it helps to calculate, and however economists would like to calculate the harms according to those eras, I think that will be helpful language in moving forward with that.
Yeah. Dr. Potter, do you want to offer some thoughts on it? I know Representative Rabb, you wanted to kind of add some more layer to it.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think that the definition needs to be, or who is included needs to be attached to the acts and the time periods more than it does blood quantum. Again, you can use indigenous histories to look at how that plays out against the communities. But one thing I do want to keep at the forefront of the dialogue is that whatever we pass, whatever definition happens, it's going to have to go through court attacks from the white supremacists. And we've seen this, for example, with the Black farmers that didn't get their aid because it was attacked under the 14th Amendment. So we can't pass a reparations package legally specifically for Black people. We need to keep that in mind, that will not hold up in court, and that will completely end any process of trying to distribute what we already gained. So I think whatever definitions we use, it needs to be expansive, the most inclusive, and then strategically designed so that it will hold up against any 14th Amendment challenges that are going to come through from people that don't want to see reparations happen.
Yeah, Representative Rabb.
So yesterday I drove my sons from Chicago to Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania to come back to Philly late last night. And as a genealogy nerd for the past 30 years, I can tell you stories of my Black ancestors in all of those states. They were migratory. And so I adopted Pennsylvania as my home 20 years ago. But you, Charles, if you have ancestors who were in Pennsylvania in all of those three eras that Jessica outlined, and you can document that, and you can identify, you can independently prove that you identified as a Black person, you should get more money than me, because I've just been here 20 years, and someone who's been here 2 years should get less than that potentially, right? I mean, it's based on, if you believe that the longer you and your people have been in a state, and that state has been complicit in systemic racism, that means more harm will have come to you over that, the longer you've been in a state that has supported white supremacist policies. So we have to look at it sort of, as Dr. Potter said, it shouldn't be around how much, African blood you have. It's how you identify and how your people have identified over certain historical eras where that harm can be independently documented. And so one of the things that I've done in preparation for this bill is to highlight, amplify, compile all the racist laws and court cases in Pennsylvania from colonial times to the present. And it's massive. And 99% of my colleagues in the legislature, past and present, have no idea how extraordinarily inhumane these laws have been. They just don't know. It's not like when we took office, they give you a compendium of racist laws or misogynistic laws or anti-indigenous laws. You got to learn on your own. So when we look at all of the things that have been done over time, what it looks like in Pennsylvania is going to be very different than what it looks like in South Carolina, right? Because gradual abolition began in 1780 in Pennsylvania. If it was 1865 in Mississippi, you have a different dynamic. And so what those different eras are should be connected to the history, culture, and policies of that given state. But those are the factors that should be laid out. It should be how long you've been there. And also too, because now with the DNA tests, if there's a white person who says, oh, I'm 2% Black, no, I'm gonna get my reparations. That's not gonna happen, because it should be how you identify on government records, right? Because that's what you are actively saying, irrespective of how poorly my people are treated, I still identify as Black. There should be some documentation to that point.
And you're giving us a glimpse into your lived experience. And we all know what the lived Black experience is. I'm biracial, but grew up in a Black neighborhood, full Black neighborhood in North Philadelphia. I had that lived Black North Philadelphia experience, the struggles of that. And so, yeah, exactly. So that's an interesting point, which gets to another question, which Debbie Ann Page raised. She's a genealogist as well. Can you speak to the role, Jessica, of genealogical research in locating the descendants of enslavement? Because Representative Rabb just made a really good point. But that is going to be key, Debbie. Thank you for that question. Jessica, if you would speak to that, that may end up being, right, we may need to, if say reparations comes together, we start appropriating money to implement it. One of those things we may need to appropriate for is genealogical research.
Well, I think genealogical research plays an important role in understanding what has happened to us and the different harms and being able to trace our ancestors. I'm hesitant at attaching it to reparations law or commission, because I'm thinking about all of the things that we currently face due to legal tracking and that kind of thing. I'm not convinced yet that it will be used 100% for good. Though I do think it is helpful, like somebody like me that's Gullah Geechee, I know that I can walk into Charleston right now and probably get a lot more information than some other people could get. But I do think if we would teeter back into the blood quantum conversation, and I'm just not 100% convinced that that requiring that level of documentation for every Black person that would potentially receive reparations is necessary, or that it would benefit us in a substantial way, or that it wouldn't be used against us in some type of a way. But, again, maybe the HR 40 Commission would look at that and feel differently. I know a lot of people feel differently around it, but that's just my thoughts on it.
This is a good segue into a concept, Dr. Potter, that you came up with in a B note not too long ago. If folks go to the bnote.com, THEBE note.com, it's the companion magazine, the exclusive companion magazine to Reality Check on WURD. And Dr. Potter, of which you're the senior editor, you wrote something entitled Running on Reparations in 2022. You you came up with this concept of a blacklist, a literal blacklist. It's a reparations registration roll, and that should begin immediately. And so it's not in the negative connotation. You say, think of it as the essential first step to making reparations a reality. That list should be used to generate enough momentum of support from and for Black communities in their efforts to liberate themselves from Confederate political control in states like Alabama, Louisiana, and the Carolinas. What is that? What's the blacklist? Explain.
Well, for me, I think one of the things that we've really learned from the pandemic is that when it comes to reaching poor Black people, we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to do it when we're registering voters. We don't know how to do it when we're getting shots in arms. We don't know how to do it when we're getting child tax credits out or stimulus checks out. So a lot of this is things that we can start building now. We can start creating a registration process for people that think that they have the ability or should be able to claim reparations. And that's going to serve a lot of purposes. Like one, just coming off of what we're talking about with, well, who qualifies, that'll give us a lot of data. Who's actually applying for this? Who thinks they're entitled to this? What percentage of them are descendants of slave? What percentage are from the Caribbean? Like what's our population that we're looking at? It's something we could start now. We could start pulling things from voter registration rolls and start making a list that way, or through other things where people have identified as Black, and start creating a list and have an online registry where people can apply. But the point is that we can continue these really important dialogues about, the idea of it. What's the price tag? What sectors is it going to go into? Those are all really big ideas, but they don't really put motion in the ground. And I think that we can start creating the infrastructure for distribution right now and start creating a list of people that want to get it, or that need it, or that qualify, so that when we do pass that, pass reparations, we can get it to them. And then also it can be used to identify people to help them. We can't get reparations if we can't get people to vote for reparations in Congress. So we can also use it as a tool to mobilize people in Black heavy states that are really facing some severe voter suppression laws, to help them, to reach them, and then to help them figure out how to overcome those obstacles, so we can get a Congress that will push through HR 40 and then whatever comes after that.
That's a very good point. Oh, go ahead, Representative Rabb.
There's also a few other benefits, and I strongly support the deep suspicion that Jessica shared when you're talking about big government. And frankly, if you think about the far left and the far right, they both have a healthy disdain of Big Brother, right? So issues around surveillance, issues around data mining and DNA and all those issues. And trust me, as a genealogist who does do DNA work, I'm very, very
I didn't know that.
Emotions around that. And
I had no idea. Okay.
Yeah. So I do the DNA platforms, and I know that, my genetic code is being used for all sorts of things that are beyond my control. But I feel it's an obligation as one of the genealogists in my family to document as much as possible why I'm alive and why many of my elders are still alive. But here's the thing. So again, I'm going back to the state. The state, there in Pennsylvania, they had something called the slave registers. There are all kinds of official government documents that documented Black folk. And the vast majority of their descendants may not know who their ancestors were in Pennsylvania or anywhere else. So there's one thing for someone like me who's been kind of groomed as a genealogist in my family over decades, who know my ancestors and are trying to document their footsteps. It's another for another Black person to not know anything about their Black ancestors, and the government, albeit an entity that is, autonomous or independent of the legislature, saying, hey, this may be your ancestor. And this is what this community was doing in and for Pennsylvania. This was the community that had a rebellion against white supremacists. This was a group that had the first Supreme Court case that came from these Black farmers in Center County. So it's both ways. It's not just those of us who are privileged to know so much about our African ancestors, but it's also the government doing its job to help healing and connect people with that historical that historical connection with that state and with those communities within that state. It could be a powerful experiment, and we're already doing it for bad purposes. Let's figure out how to do it responsibly in ways that bring people together. And that's really part of the truth and reconciliation process too, potentially saying, this is much our Commonwealth, this is much our country as it is anyone else. And here are our contributions. And here's a direct line between you, poor, Black, and rural in Pennsylvania, and some of the most meaningful contributions to our democracy 300 years ago. That could be powerful. That
could be real powerful.
On steroids.
Yeah, and also, Jessica, you were saying in the Zoom group chat, the census, I mean, is the other just really good way of creating all this, or getting started on that, or when we get to that point of reparations were implemented, identifying who gets those, who's eligible for those reparations. We had a question here from an attendee of the of our panel here of the CSG East annual meeting. This is State Representative Emma Mulvaney Stanek, who I'm sorry, Representative, if I mispronounced that name, who is a state representative out of Vermont. There's a lot of conversation in Vermont, by the way, Vermont of all states, about reparations, truth and reconciliation commissions, equity impact assessments. We're finding out they're doing a lot of interesting legwork up there in Vermont. But the representative asking, how can we work to build trust with Black communities and other folks of color with reparations, as many, rightfully, do not trust government-based systems or solutions on so many systemic harms, racist laws, et cetera? How would some trust a registry, like what Dr. Potter was describing, like a blacklist, for example? Jessica, your thoughts on that?
I think about that. That's part of what I was thinking about with the genealogy part too. Dr. Potter raised a good point about the fact that it appears that we can't reach poor Black communities. But I would say that it appears that government-led entities are not up to the task of reaching poor Black communities, because if they were to reach them, like, let's say for vaccines, where are the vaccination sites? At malls, at the grocery store, at stops, at the train station? That is where we are. And I think that when we have a HR 40 commission, if we were to go and do a Black a list, a registry, we really need to rely on our cultural competence, because that's the disconnect there. Even with the voting and all that other stuff, folks are not reaching our communities because we're not, and I'm not saying it's us specifically, but we know who's in charge of like certain things. And it's usually not a Black person or a person with cultural competency to reach those communities. So I think if we were to do that, we need to embrace our cultural competency. And I think that would help build trust by going into our communities where we know people are, on a daily basis, where we know we can meet people face to face and explain it and I'm pretty sure people would sign up if that face to face interaction was there with people that had a culturally sound plan for reaching our communities. Yeah.
Dr. Potter, your thoughts on that as well? Are people going to trust us if we start implementing it as something that's government led, or if there's a really significant core government element to it, creating like a blacklist or a registry, for example? Are people even going to even trust that?
I don't think everybody can or should trust the government at every point in time. I think we absolutely have to be strategic in our approach. A couple of things there. Reparations is going to come from a government action ultimately. So we have to find a way to make the fruits of that get to the people that need it and deserve that. And I think that we absolutely have to tap into community culture, and that a lot of that is going to be really identifying and supporting organizations that are already in the community doing that work. I've been pushing for a while now in terms of getting, people out to vote. It's so important for us to vote, especially right now, that we can't be doing these large level national campaigns or even sometimes state level campaigns. We really have to go door to door, go to the communities that are work, support them, and then help them get the things they need. So like things like rental assistance that people need
That's
that
right.
they're getting right now. We can, without saying, hey, we're the government, we can just go and be like, hey, do you need this? Do you need this service? Let me help you sign up, and start really building that trust relationship where we get things to the people that they need, and maybe not just do it through the government, but do it through proxies like community organizations, churches, youth groups, that kind of thing. But yeah, that trust, I mean, we're seeing it with the vaccines. It's something that needs to be built. So on one end, yes, the government isn't doing what it needs to do to reach out, and community orgs can fill that. But I think we need a functioning government. So if we can use these types of things like reparations, vaccines, rental assistance as an opportunity to build those networks that have been neglected, then we can also, walk and chew gum at the same time with that.
Representative Rabb, I was laughing at something you wrote in the Zoom group chat. We trust the lottery.
So talk about the lottery.
No, we don't. We do trust the lottery, don't we? Right?
Listen, you could say, hey, when you scratch off that thing, that has enzymes and it's going to get in your system and it's going to put a microchip. Nobody, because they're thinking about getting paid, right?
Right,
so there's a clear value associated with the lottery, and they could say, well, look, I might have a microchip in me, but if I get $1 million, I'm okay with that. People take SNAP money, and most people on SNAP and get food stamps are white folk, right? Poor white folk, millions and millions of poor white folk. That's government. They trust it. So I think this notion that government can't do it, it has to do with do people understand its value and how it's operated. My grandma, who was a community organizer in Baltimore, used to say, you can tell the true politics of an organization by its budget and its board. Right. And so if you have someone running public health and it's Dr. Fauci, that's one thing. But if it's, Chris Christie or I should be honest, you know what I'm saying, right? If someone who doesn't believe in science running something around public health, that's problematic. So it depends on who it is. Do they have the actual authority? Do they have the budget to do what's necessary? Because we actually do know how to reach poor people. We know how to reach poor people very well. We don't have the political will to do so because we want to disempower poor people, because people in power are afraid of them because the more of them there are of us. But if we invested the resources and invested in the right people who have connections, who are from those communities, we could do all of this stuff much easier, but we don't. And that's really for, cynical, self-serving reasons.
All right. And then Connecticut State Representative Robin Porter joining us again as an attendee for the CSG East virtual annual meeting, is also watching this conversation. And she's saying, yes, grassroots, boots on the ground. It's the most effective course of action, and it resonates the best with our constituents. Bingo, you're preaching, Rep Rabb. So that's your colleague up in the great state of Connecticut, Representative Robin Porter, whom I feel like we could have had her on this panel too. Maybe, so we'll do a part 3. Maybe get her on and get her perspective as well. That actually wraps this panel. I'm going to have to give you the last word, Rep Rabb, because we ran out of time. It was a fantastic discussion. We will do it again. Appreciate your time, Representative. Pennsylvania State Representative Chris Rabb represents the 200th Legislative District in the Commonwealth. Go to pahouse.com/Rabb. If you live in the 200th district, you got to get in touch with your state representative. It's always very important. Understand what's happening in the state capitol and how you can access resources from there at Rep Rabb. Jessica Aiwuyor, who is the founder, president of the National Black Cultural Information Trust, nbcit.org. And always, Jessica, always so much appreciate your time, because I know you're very busy as well. You got a lot going on and off Capitol Hill. And it's just such a pleasure and an honor to always have you, because I know you're doing that work, and we do appreciate it. That's why we bring you on these discussions and to add value to it. Dr. G.S. Potter, thank you. Senior editor of the bnote.com. She came in at the last possible minute, literally moments before this panel started, and said, yes, I can do it. And that was a great decision that we ended up making. Thank you, and many thanks, gratitude to your children, to your little ones too, because we heard them in the background and letting their mom give us a few minutes of her time. Dr. Potter, senior editor of the bnote.com. Thank you all. I want to thank Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, more specifically, the Council on Communities of Color, and the chairs, the chairman and vice chair of the CCC, State Senator Kevin Parker out of New York. Thank you. And I know he's lurking somewhere, and Maryland House Delegate Jocelyn Pena Melnick, who talked with us earlier. She's out of Maryland. She's a vice chair, and really appreciate you, Delegate. Appreciate you, Debbie Ann Page, for making these possible, and appreciate the WURD audience. We are now going to take a break, and we're going to transition into a regular Wednesday edition of Reality Check here on 96.1 FM, 900 AM, WURDradio.com, WURD TV, WURD app. Thank you again for all everybody, and stay tuned. We'll be right back. Thank you. That was great.
Hey, thank you. That was awesome as usual. It was a pleasure meeting you, Jessica.
You too.
You got
connect with you for real.
Yes, yes. Please connect. Yeah, do that. I'll help facilitate if you need me.
Please do. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right.
All right. You all be safe out there. Thanks again.